Okay, I think it's now recording. Okay, so hey everyone who's watching this on the recording afterwards. Um, so this is like a video conference around Raost. I think there's a lot of different pronunciations around it. I kind of call them Raost because Scott Rayo. Um, but I've heard like Raost and stuff like that. So anyway, it's fine. I don't really care. Um, and specifically the last profile I uploaded, which is the adaptive Raost. So I'll start kind of sorry, here it is. I'll start sharing the studio window. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. So this is the adaptive Raost profile, which I uploaded a couple of weeks ago, I guess. And so the main things that I'm kind of considering over here in the design process of the roast profile is a couple of different issues that I kind of take care of in most of my roasting, whether it's on the Kaffelogic or another roaster, which is basically the variance, which is how can I repeat a roast of a specific coffee and have not that much variance between them, consistency. The control of the ROR curve, which is on the studio, this green curve, that goes through it, which is, as most of you might know, some of you might not, which is the derivative of the actual bean temperature curve, right? So I think a lot of people that are interested in roasting and have roasted and kind of like getting into it, kind of understand that it's an important thing, but don't really, give it that much thought. Don't really care about it that much, which I would say is sort of an issue. I would say in most times the ROR curve is the single most important thing I actually look at in a roast. And this is, as you might know, heavily informed by Scott Rayo's writing on roasting and some of his consulting I've done, with him, and also just experience roasting. As I mentioned before, I've mentioned, throughout the Kaffelogic forum, I'm also a professional. I've been a professional barista for a while, like a little bit over 10 years. And I've been roasting commercially as well, like a couple of years as well. So I have found, and I do agree with the notion that when you have when you have a smoothly declining ROR curve, you do have better coffee. And that's related to the vibrancy of the acidity, is related to the sensation and perception of sweetness. Although we now sort of know that we don't have actual sweetness in coffee, we just have the sensation of it, which is contributed by a number of different factors such as aroma, viscosity, and acidity, and sort of like the acidity bitterness balance. But I have found the like a very noticeable, higher sensation of acidity when I have a slightly like a smoothly declining ROR curve. Always, basically. Now, I think there's a lot of other intuitive things that are, of course, very important, which are kind of obvious. Is how hot you get the coffee, how much time it goes through the roasting process, right? But I think that's where the objectiveness of how you should be roasting kind of ends, because you might perfectly enjoy a coffee that's roasted for longer, or a coffee that's roasted to a higher temperature, like slightly darker roast, slightly lighter roast, very high, very low. That's basically, I don't really get into that sort of, like gatekeeping of this is how you should roast. But I do think the ROR curve is a very, very clear indicator of how technically well developed and well established a roast actually is. There's a couple of reasons behind that are not necessarily heavily consensus around the commercial environment. I think the reasons that kind of most make more sense to me have to do with the fact that while we see temperature and time in the graph of any roasting curve, we don't really see pressure, which is a really important factor, I think, to have to consider throughout roasting. And the fact that coffee and most things heat up in a very specific fashion because of physics, because of Newton's law and heat transfer in general, thermodynamics in general, it only makes sense that coffee deaccelerates its increase in temperature as the roast progresses in order to avoid an excessive amount of pressure that the actual structure of bean cannot hold, which will result in a number of different things, such as drastic increases in temperature or decreases in temperature that will actually throw off the momentum of the whole roast, as well as the chain reactions that are called chain reactions for a reason, and you actually need the whole kind of rings in the chain to go like one after the other. And if you lose momentum, you kind of break that. And that's what I think in terms of the sensation actual tasting, we think of as baking coffee. Okay, so that's basically the theory behind why I think the ROR curve is like pretty much the most important thing in roasting. It actually kind of relates to pressure, which I think is not something we kind of discuss as much. But it is like a really, really important factor. And I think it's it only makes sense that one of the most important and difficult moments in roasting is actually first crack, right? Actually first crack, management, and after crack, how you manage the development time, as the same Rayo kind of coined. I don't know if anyone has any question from what I just said. Yeah, glad.
I have two questions. One question, looking at your ROR curve and the adaptive profile, do I understand correct that from the minute like 8:20, where the ROR is getting 0, this is actually the maximum roasting time for this curve?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, yes and no. I would say that the thing about this sort of part of the roast, the part of the profile, is kind of like a quirk of the software, to like more
This
than
is
anything
like
else.
a baking. After 8:20, it's not a transfer of energy to the bean, it's
Well, I
baking.
mean,
It's keeping
if
the
you
temperature
actually,
constant.
yeah, well, I mean, not really. I mean, because the profile itself, it's not designed to go over that point, over the point
Okay.
that the ROR goes to 0.
Okay.
I will go over the whole instructions of it, and we'll just kind of like dial in. But this is basically a quirk of the software, which I kind of got around with these 2 points. So I just was thinking what came to be this profile is that the amount of points needed to actually make a profile are basically 2. Like mathematically speaking, if I wanted to have like a perfectly like 45-degree ROR curve, I would basically need 2 points, right? A beginning point and an end point. and just by affecting, the curve of this line, right? I would arrive at different, ROR curves, and if this point, is at the same temperature as the endpoint, so over here it's 222, right? If I type 222 over here, and if I actually get to that would be like one axis, right? So temperature is kind of settled. It's the same temperature as the endpoint. And just by altering, the time, the other axis of the curve, you get to that curve, which is pretty much, 45 degrees like throughout.
No, it's logical.
Right.
I ask this in the idea that if someone like more dark roasts, probably he should work at this, change these very last 2 points. That's it.
Right,
Because
definitely.
after 820 it will bake, so it will just rise. It will play there.
Right.
The other question I had, it was first crack management.
Yeah.
How do you decide with a Kaffelogic when is the first crack? Because I have the feeling that we are slightly different here. So
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's sort of a problem throughout roasting, I guess. Where is first crack? I kind of dismiss the sound most of the time, which is sort of like wild to think about, because it's basically the most apparent indicator of, okay, so now it's actually doing the sound, it's cracking, it's the first crack, right? Yeah, Timberwolf actually does say that. He doesn't really pay attention to cracks. But I think it is important to actually know where it is, because we do see, in some studies conducted by Raost and and I think Morton actually kind of was talking about that same thing, that it actually is provable and verifiable that amount of time after first crack is a very good indicator of development in general. So sort of reinvestigating the validity of the term, development time ratio. But yeah, when is actually first crack? I think it kind of goes by understanding what first crack is, which is the first, like in general, the exothermic reaction of the coffee, and the point where coffee is kind of letting go of the accumulated steam pressure inside, right? And if the coffee is like very uniform and it's very soft, I guess, and it's not really hard, that pressure will build up, will go up to a certain point, and then it will be all kind of released, right? Whereas when we have harder coffees, and as well when we have uneven coffees or bigger lots, which are usually like a blend of varieties and stuff like that, you will have different structures within the seed. So the accumulated pressure in different seeds will release at different times. So that's why you have a certain amount of time where you kind of hear the pops on development time. But what it actually is, and when you actually mark the start, I think it has to do with, as they mentioned, Wendable talks about temperature. I think the Kaffelogics, like one of its weaknesses is the absence of an actual temperature reading on the environment on top of the coffee, which would be very useful because I use it all the time in drum roasting. So you use basically the environment probe, the environment temperature probe, to actually see where the decreasing temperature kind of goes back, and you can actually see that with the ROR curve of the environmental temperature probe. And that's basically an objective way to actually find first crack, which is when does the coffee slightly
but with
get cold.
Kaffelogic, you decide,
right.
you hear a crack, then
Right.
half a minute,
So
1 minute,
to go over
nothing
this,
happens, and
right?
then you
To
hear
go over
bang
that,
bang.
I just kind of marked the first one. Basically, I
I do
mean,
the
as
same
soon
thing.
as I hear, any sort of pop or crack, I just, mark first crack. I do kind of correct that sometimes afterwards on the studio software, because sometimes I'll be like, okay, so that first crack sounded like
Might
a
not have been a
minute
first crack.
before
Yeah.
everything else.
Mm.
But and I do keep note of that. But the thing is that while it's important to actually know where first crack happens and when development time starts, as long as you're consistent with how you actually take note of it and actually log it, it doesn't really make much of a difference, because it's not translatable to other roasters anyway. Even if we all have the same coffee and the same roaster, if we mark same crack, first crack at different temperatures, of course we're going to have different degrees of development time, right? But I wouldn't really ask you, how much development time are you given this coffee to have that result. I would just, in that scenario, I would just look at and temperature and time,
Understand. For me, first
right?
crack, it's important because I'm not using the DTR. I'm using the development time. So from that moment,
Right.
the development time begins for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because DTR is a relative value. It's, a
Right.
DTR of 20% for 5 minutes, it's 1 minute development, and for 10 minutes
Mm-hmm.
roast, it's 2 minutes development. So it's a big difference for me.
Yeah, I
I,
mean, I
But
think
think
both are
DTR in general has
20%.
been giving too much emphasis anyway, right?
yeah, for sure. And to give credit to Rayo as well, he specifically has stated numerous times that do not drop a batch based on DTR, which I think a lot of people kind of misunderstood anyway. I'll get to the humidity in just a second. So to kind of wrap up that sort of thing with DTR and development time, I think I mean I personally still prefer to use DTR as a value instead of development time, because as you said, is a relative value. And one thing that we're kind of dismissing as well in that scenario where we're just keeping track of development time is that it's a whole roast. If you roast, of course, if you have a roast that lasts 10 minutes, of course it's not going to be the same as a roast of 5 minutes, right? And 20% development on both roasts, of course it's not going to be the same. That's not really what DTR stands for. But it is sort of more intuitive to actually think of it as a relative value to the roast, because there's also different pressures getting built up inside the seats. So faster roasting will usually render faster chemical reactions as well. And in the sort of a comparable time frame for development time,
I
a
understand.
faster roast will have more development in, let's say, a 25 DTR roast than probably a 10-minute roast with a 10% DTR value, right? And
Yes,
that's sort
but
of where
look, there is another factor, I think, which is important during the development, which is the difference of temperature between first crack and end of roasting, because
yeah,
with the same DTR you can have, let's say, zero, so no temperature change. I'm exaggerating now, or
right.
have 20 degrees. So both have the same DTR, but this will be completely different roasts.
Well, I mean, for sure. I mean, I think in most cases, the decision of how much development time ratio you have on the roast has to do with how much momentum and how much pressure you think the coffee can withstand. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone. Because for me, when I think of roasting and getting into first crack, I do kind of notice how high the ROR is at that point, which is nothing more than the slope of the bean temperature probe, right? So
Right.
how fast are you going into first crack is a very important factor, in my opinion. So one thing I sort of have been doing is that for coffees that are, heavily fermented naturals, or, extended drying, that sort of processing. I've found that usually those coffees, while they're harder and while they're denser, sometimes they're kind of more fragile because they're not as they don't really hold pressure as much. So I do kind of, with those coffees, tend to just get to a lower development in general, but that sort of relates not just to the DTR value, but the value of the DTR, the ROR curve at first crack, if that makes sense. I try to arrive at first crack slower.
Which ROR, it's your ideal ROR for, in this case, to enter in the first crack?
It depends on the coffee, really, because so this sort of profile is
as you said, natural, fermented, high density.
All right. So, first off, sorry about this, but there's an issue with the studio software with M1 MacBooks, which doesn't really tell you how much ROR, what's the ROR value of any point of the curve, which is sort of annoying. But this sort of profile as is kind of meant for washed, like regular coffees, I guess. And I use this as a kind of a blueprint for other coffees. Yeah, don't worry about it. I'll upload a recording. I don't know if the chat actually gets into the recording, but someone said that they're gonna take some rest. Yeah, bedtime. I'll go over everything of the chat anyway. By the way, just don't worry if I'm not addressing it right now. So yeah, for let's say the ROR value of a regular roast for regular washed coffees at first crack would probably be something along the lines of like between like 5 and 8 degrees per minute, let's say. That's a sort of like a regular pace of roasting for those kind of coffees. I would assume for most people. I would shoot for maybe 4, maybe 5, like in the lower range of that broader range for natural process. Especially if it's like a very like extended fermentation. However, I would always kind of just roast and taste and roast and taste and go with that. Because I find that sometimes the theoretical approach is all good and well, but tasting is paramount anyway.
Yeah.
Right. So if I don't really like how the coffee is tasting, I just try different shit until I kind of come up with something I enjoy. And I do think that that's sort of, if you can understand anything from this sort of seminar, if you could call it that, I guess, or just conversation around the roasting on the Kaffelogic, just try it and taste it. I think tasting is really, really, really important, and most roasters, when they're getting into roasting, kind of lose track of that. If that makes sense. You get like very caught up on the graphs and the temperatures and the times and stuff like that, and the numbers and how you actually dial in this. But tasting is, I mean, if the graph doesn't look as good, but the coffee is really good, maybe it could be better, but it's not something that you should necessarily change if you have like a limited amount of coffee to roast anyway. So, okay, so I think I'll go over some of the questions on the chat. Taylor asks if I measure humidity. I do. Although I do kind of work with the roaster side, the green coffee buyers and importers I usually work with usually have a lot of information around humidity, the moisture and stuff like that. And it's usually like straight on. It's usually, I mean, I've checked it like a bunch of times, and it's usually pretty accurate. I do use it mostly as a benchmark for rehydration, which I do really, really often, which is something we can actually go into later as well. But yeah, the profile is really sort of addressed for regular, commercial guidelines for moisture in coffee. The usual 10 to 12% moisture is what this profile kind of assumes. Although I would say that if you're rehydrating coffee, because of the way the Kaffelogic works, I wouldn't really say that it's that necessary to heavily edit the profile if you're rehydrating. So, I mean, of course, it depends on what's your target, but it's not that much of a difference because of the PIE just swoops in and takes charge. I do kind of adjust slightly the preheat for that sort of thing, slightly higher value for preheat on rehydrated beans, but that's usually not that much of a difference anyway. I usually target 16% humidity, sorry, moisture. And that relates to Chris Farron's writing as well. When I've found, I agree with most of the stuff he says about that issue. Okay, so I think I'll go over a little bit of the profile, and I'll just okay. So this is the actual profile, and as I was saying before, the last 2 points are there just because the studio software doesn't allow me to just have 2 points in one profile. It needs at least 3. And these 2 are meant to always stay at the same temperature. You can edit slightly, the time between them, and that doesn't really make much of a difference. But I would always end the roast before this point, before the second to last point. Because after that point, as Vlad pointed out, the ROR curve goes flat, and the roaster, unless you have end by time ratio value set for just time, the roaster won't stop the roast at any predictable time. Because the roaster, this dotted red line that goes through the curve is the roast end by time ratio, this value, right? Add in a default profile, the actual Kaffelogic Classic profile, that's set at 0.33333, which is sort of a saying that the roaster kind of takes into account both temperature and time, but gives slightly more importance to temperature as a benchmark, as a factor into when I end the roast, when it actually automated, the roast ends. So by changing that value, you kind of change the slope of this curve, right? The red dotted line curve. And if you had a value, that I think it's in this case, sorry. So 1.0 is a value that makes it end by just time. So that would be a vertical line, and actually just show that. So I press 1 over there. Now that dotted line is vertical, right? So the roast will actually end on that time, regardless of the temperature you arrive at. And unless you do that, you should definitely end the roast before that ROR goes flat. And I would prefer if that wasn't the case, but that's just like a workaround around the profile, around
this roast end after a time X is always beginning with the first crack, so the chronometer will start. Yeah. If you say I want to stop after 1 minute, it's 1 minute after the first crack. Yeah.
No. It's actually that
from the
relates to the whole roast. Yeah.
Got it.
So if the curve that dotted line is on, let's say, the 7 minutes, regardless of what temperature you are at 7 minutes, that's when the roaster will end the roast. That's basically how it works. And it's a really nice feature, I guess, from the Kaffelogic, which kind of sets it apart from other roasters, is that you can just control the criteria that the roaster takes. And it's not necessary that just you're over there and just pressing the button to actually end the roast, which is pretty neat. But yeah, that's sort of the issue. And as I said, that I would always end the roast before that point. Okay. So I'll just go over the profile instructions, right? So I'll just read them through like one time, and if anybody has any questions, just let me know. I'll be reading over here, so if anybody has any questions, just like speak out, because I won't necessarily read the chat. Okay, so this profile is designed based on Scott Raost's concept and recommendations on roasting, as well as my experience with the Kaffelogic, and to be modified to suit your needs while making sure important things are taken care of. Specifically, the smooth decline in the ROR curve. And there's a bunch of starting points of parameters that I think most roasting most coffee will be suited by this roast, such as around 20% development on the default setting, sort of medium light temperature, that sort of thing. Okay, so the default settings are set for an 80-gram batch with a 20% development at an end temperature of 220 degrees Celsius in around 7 minutes and 20 seconds. So yeah, that's now the thing about the roast, even though it's not actually adaptive, I guess, because it doesn't really adapt itself, is that it's meant to be edited quite easily. So that's sort of the sorry, I'll just move this over here. So it's meant to be just edited to suit your needs. Specifically, if you want to roast darker, lighter, have a bigger batch, smaller batch, stuff like that. I will go over as Martin said. When you're actually deciding what to do on a roast, what actually is the result of going for a higher DTR value with a lower temperature and stuff like that, or at least what I've found to be the case. Okay, so the profile is quite straightforward in these instructions. For a bigger batch, I would recommend increasing the preheat power because the roaster will need more wattage at the start of the roast to actually move thermically more coffee at the start before the actual PID engages. And with a couple of more than a couple of batches of testing with a specific coffee, I found that the 75 to 100 watts per additional 10 grams on the roast will render really similar roasting. So for instance, I have over here a couple of batches. So this is a 100-gram batch, and this is a couple of 100-gram batches and a couple of 70-gram batches. And I've cupped these side to side, blind tasting. I've had a couple of colleagues, but not that they work with me, but other roasters, cup these without knowing what they are. And I have found that at the same development time and temperature and general roast level, these different batches were pretty much undistinguishable for most people. And most people that actually found difference were kind of just like guessing. But yeah, that's sort of, I think that's something neat that the way this profile is sort of done and kind of the result of it was enough to actually ensure, I guess, that if you want to roast, let's say 70 grams, or you want to roast 100 grams, the results are going to be really, really similar for the same coffee as well. So that sort of thing I kind of tested throughout. Smaller batch, different, the same, but in the other direction. And the transformation of the RPMs, a couple of people ask me, how that's done, and it's really easy. If you have a Windows laptop, just Control T or Command T on Mac, which is basically the tools, the transform profile on the toolbar. So let's say if I wanted to transform the RPMs, I would go to the fan profile curve, hit that option, and whatever value I enter here as a factor will just factor all these numbers, right? So let's say just go over something ridiculous. If I want to double the RPMs, I just hit 2 and apply, and now it's double the value. That sort of thing's really, really easy. So related to the question of how much is a slightly higher value, the reason I said it like that and wrote it like that is that I have no idea, because it actually relates to the fan calibration, and relates to the specific coffee you're using, how much agitation you actually need and want for your roast. And while I agree that there's sort of like a reasonable range for agitation, there's not really a specific amount of agitation that's better, because it's just different heat transfer dynamics. When you have a higher agitation, when you have a higher fan speed, what you're also doing is that you're giving more work to the heating element and your power supply. So you have if you have been encountering power supply issues, if your roast kind of doesn't have enough juice to just like push the end of the roast, in some cases I would recommend going to the lower going for a lower value in RPMs in general. But that will mean, or probably will mean, that you will have slightly more conductive heat transfer between the seeds, and potentially if you're going like batch to batch to batch and roasting back to back, you will inevitably heat the roaster slightly more. Now, how much of that is perceptible? It's debatable as well. So I would say that in most cases, you have a broad range of RPMs that are going to pretty much work exactly the same for most people and most coffees. So if you are sort of in a reasonable amount of agitation that you actually see the coffee just like swirling around, I would say that's pretty good, and I would really worry about that unless I'm encountering power supply issues and stuff like that. Any question around that? No? Okay, perfect. So that's related to the amount of coffee you're actually roasting. So higher temperature and similar DTR. This is basically just roasting darker, in my sort of opinion. And how do you do this? Well, you can either transform the temperature roast profile, right? So that would be the same adjustment. So over here on the roast profile curve, just Command or Control T, and you can apply a factor to temperature. Let's say 1.1, and over here I'm on 219.5 and temperature, and what will happen is that the development time will have gone down because I'm still ending the roast at 219.5. So in order to actually get the same development, I would need to increase in temperature to the same degree as the factor I actually applied, right? If you're increasing this much, of course, that would be impractical in most cases, because the actual temperature will be too high, and the levels that you actually can edit over here will need to change accordingly if you're actually roasting that dark. I don't know if that makes sense for everyone, but that's pretty much what you get when you actually roasting darker. You actually go over the range I usually recommend, which is not necessarily something negative, just it will be different. And this sort of, without necessarily you wanting it, will actually also affect the relative proportion of the other parts of the curve, which is natural as well. Any question over here? Okay, so yeah, if you want to roast darker, you can either transform or I'll just go back. Well, I'll just open the file again. It's pretty annoying that. Okay. So you can actually you can either transform the profile. I would recommend, if you want to transform it by a factor, just actually you can calculate how much of a factor you need to apply in order to actually get the temperature you want. So let's say if you're around 220 and you want to shoot for 225 with that same 20%, just work out regular calculator, how much of an increase in temperature as a factor you would need to actually get there, which is basically just dividing 100 by 220 and then multiplying it by 225 in this case, and then subtracting the 100, which is pretty simple, I guess. If anyone needs any help with that, I can definitely be of any service. Yeah, but you can also just kind of add degrees, and this will add that number in degrees Celsius to the curve. So if I just wanted 1, that will now end in 221 with the same development, right? But this doesn't really change the development relative to the curve. It just increases the temperature of the whole roast. And use this sparingly, because the start temperature will also be affected by both of those changes, which doesn't really mean anything other than the roaster will probably just start taking the time of the roast when it achieves that temperature. So let's say you have coffee at room temperature at 20 degrees, and the roast starts at, let's say, I don't know, like something like 35 degrees. The roaster will still, start the roast at 20-degree coffee, but it will start counting when it arrives at 35 degrees. I don't know if you actually have encountered that, but I have. That sort of thing. Okay. And the reason this sort of works and actually gets to the same development with different temperature is that you're basically just moving this up and down the y-axis, which is pretty straightforward. Okay. Same thing, but in reverse for a lower end temperature and same or similar DTR. Now, as to why you would want to get to a higher temperature or lower temperature with the same DTR, it kind of relates to a bigger, broader kind of way of thinking about roasting, where if you actually think of roasting as a continuum of more roasting or less roasting, you just have different options to arrive at any of those ends of the spectrum. So if you want to roast more, let's say, as a broader idea, you can choose to go for a higher temperature at the end of the roast. You can go for same temperature, sorry, but for a longer time. Or you can usually go for, let's say, a smaller batch with the same temperatures. That would usually render higher development because the heat transfer will be higher to a relative lower batch. But that sort of isn't really the case with Kaffelogic because it's a PID. Or you can just shoot for more DTR, right? And the effect of these different approaches will be different on different coffees, which is I know is an underwhelming answer. But I would say that it really depends on how you're brewing or pulling shots of the coffee as well. So I would say in most cases, and this is really just like a broad idea, I would say that in most cases, if I want more body, if I want more thickness of the coffee, I would usually go for a longer roast instead of anything else. I would not necessarily go for like a higher temperature. I could, but I not necessarily would. And not necessarily would go for a higher DTR value anyway. I would usually think of thicker and more viscous coffee when I roast for longer. That's sort of been my experience with it. If I wanted more, fruitiness or vibrancy and more in general acidity, I would usually relate that to DTR. So lower DTR would be advantageous in that case. If I wanted more vibrancy, more fruit character, more crisp acidity, I would go for a lower DTR value. Hey Tom. And that sort of thing. So when I would go for a higher temperature is really when I would shoot for a different color of the coffee. So that sort of relates to the general how dark you roast your coffee in general. So the difference I usually make between espresso and filter coffee is that because of the concentration difference between espresso and filter coffee, you have a different amount of water. And if you're using the same water for both things, you usually have different degrees of acidity, right? Because the water is related to the amount of alkalinity you have within the whole brew, which compensates acidity. So if you have more water, you will compensate more of the acidity of the coffee. Hence, why most roasters roast lighter for filter and darker for espresso. Because in espresso, you have less water, less alkalinity, less buffering capacity of the water, and therefore you need to take care of that acidity somewhere else, which is usually the roaster. So that's sort of the difference I usually make. I would probably go for, in general, the lower 220 range of temperatures in general. Sometimes when I want something really light, very delicate, I would go for something between 217 to 219. But that's usually my range of preference anyway. What I do really think, and we don't really take into account as much, and we should, is resting time after roasting. And I usually go for anywhere from 2 weeks to a month or a month and a half for different coffees in order to actually rest them. And I do notice a really noticeable increase in quality and balance and stuff like that. So I have a couple of questions. Taylor said, okay, so if I want lower than usual ROR during development, let's say 1 minute development time, faster early roast with higher humidity bean, I would increase the preheat setting, I would lower the DTR, and lower the end temperature. Yeah, sort of. I mean, I would definitely try to make one adjustment at a time, as I recommended on the instructions. And I don't really. Okay, so the lower than usual ROR during development, that would mean that I'm roasting a coffee, as I said at the beginning, that doesn't take pressure as well, or is kind of fragile in that sense. So I personally would go for that sort of lower slope at that point, but not necessarily during development. I think it's the measure is more of a at what velocity you're going, when you arrive at first crack, which is actually the time where it actually makes the most of a difference, right? throughout development, you actually just you keep releasing this pressure from the coffee, but that's sort of the pinnacle of the pressure that actually has built up throughout the roast. So when you arrive at first crack, it's important that you actually are mindful of how much pressure the coffee should be allowed to build up, if that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, the instructions basically say that that if you want those things, you would go for those adjustments. But again, just try to do one at a time. Okay, so if nobody has any question about that last bit of stuff I spewed out, I'll go with the same end temperature and higher DTR. As I said, the higher DTR is something I would attempt or go for from this 20% starting point. If I say that if I have the notion that a coffee can be more interesting as time goes on through that part of the roast, I do find it that Raost writing his manifesto on this issue is really insightful, and I do agree with a bunch of stuff he says around modulating the flavor of coffee. Where, let's say, if you have a coffee that tastes of oranges, with a higher development time ratio, you would probably have that same identity of orange, but you have like a little bit more of a little more complexity to that same tasting note. So something like an orange would turn into orange peel or orange candy, or candied orange peel or something of that way. So that sort of is interesting, and I have found to be true in most cases. I do not agree that you can just alter the different parts of the roast with disregard of how the ROR curve looks, which I don't think he has said anyway. But it's really important, I think, to have priorities in your system of how you roast, how you approach roasting. And particularly in my case, I do prioritize the ROR shape. And in general, I will go for medium to medium light roast with appropriate development, whatever that means. I wouldn't go below 12% in general, unless a coffee really asks for that. And I wouldn't really go over, let's say, 25%, 27%, although I have in some cases. So what would make me go for a higher DTR or lower DTR has to do with that. Has to do with how I want the coffee to taste, but specifically in terms of the identity of the tasting notes I can pick up during cupping. And again, I have sort of backed this up with basically just tasting and blind tasting throughout a couple of years of roasting. So yeah, that sort of thing and that sort of idea is, I guess, legit in terms of with a lower development, you kind of get more simplicity of the roasting notes, the tasting notes. You do get more clarity, which is also something I strive for in general. But I guess complexity and clarity, and at least in my view right now, are sort of like they're in the same continuum as well. They're sort of like a trade-off. You can have more complex coffee and more interesting, and you can pick apart like a different types of tasting notes at the same time in parallel with more complex, more developed coffee. But you don't get the same clarity as very lightly roasted coffee and with lower development, if that makes sense. But I do think that if you're working with different kinds of coffees in terms of quality, you should be mindful as well that clarity can be good or bad depending on the coffee. So if you are actually roasting, commercial coffee and coffee that does have a lot of defects, you will get more of those with a lower development coffee. I sort of have said to a couple of students of my classes over here in Chile that I think mentally I kind of relate DTR to how generic a coffee is in those extreme cases. So if you're going like over 27-30% development time, you will probably just have coffee that's so complex and have so much different volatiles and aromatics and stuff like that. You will probably just taste the coffee because it's so many flavors put together in one stuff. Whereas if you get really lower development time, I think you would usually get more of the coffee's innate character that it's different from other coffees. But again, it's all sort of finding a balance between those two extremes, right? I wouldn't really go for really low development unless the coffee shines through that, if that makes sense. And again, tasting is the most important thing to actually know what you're striving to. But I think that's sort of what I associate to DTR as a variable and the effect I find it has, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so for a faster roast, this is pretty much the same as I said for the temperature, but with the x-axis, right? So you can transform the time of the roasting, with Command or Control T, and just apply a factor. So if you want the same roast to happen in half the time, you just press 0.5, and instead of 7 minutes 13 over here, you would get 3 minutes 30. And as you can see, the slope of the curve, of the ROR curve, is way higher. And actually, you can I'll compare it to the so it's really higher, but the steady decline of the ROR is maintained. But this will definitely mean that you will need more preheat, and potentially you will just have a lot of tipping and scorching and stuff like that, because the coffee won't be able to handle that much pressure at first crack, if that makes any sense. Now this adjustment will also need an adjustment over the fan profile curve as well. So over here, right, in order to actually maintain the steady fan speed when arriving to first crack, right? So about the fan speed and the fan curve throughout my profiles, when I started designing profiles around the concept of Rayo, one of my main issues was, okay, so how do I actually make the PID not make drastic decisions while on development time, while getting to first crack? And pretty much the immediate answer for me at least was you just lower the variables that the PID has to take account of when managing it, right? So the PID on the Kaffelogic is basically a temperature control, automation device that just depended on the sorry, I'll go over that in a second. So the PID basically just calculates, the difference between actual temperature and end temperature, and like objective temperature in a number of different ways in order to actually just control the element, right? That's pretty straightforward. It's how most of us understand PID works. But the amount of input you have for the PID changes, for the actual probe, if you have more agitation, less agitation, more contact with the coffee or less contact with the coffee. And if the PID has too much to consider, I guess that would mean that very easily the roaster can just overreact to a specific change in temperature during first crack and just have a complete mass of the profile. I first started doing this with power zones, which would just render the PID, mute, I guess, in the decision making. So, but the issue with this is that if you can't control the wattage at which the element is just before first crack, you don't really get to decide what wattage is being applied during first crack, because the only way we have power zones working is that you actually think of a percentage change in the voltage that it already has. So I say that in general, firmware update that I would really be grateful for would be like a complete manual mode, in terms of not like in the manual actual like present buttons way that the Kaffelogic actually supports, but I would love to just like design a profile just based on wattage and just deciding, okay, just apply this amount of power over here and this amount of power over here in a nominal way, instead of just relying on the decision making of something that doesn't know why it's making the decision, which is, I guess, that's sort of like a thing I care about, mainly because I do have more experience with drum roasting as well. So I'm actually controlling the gas going into the flame, and that sort of absence of control in a roaster like the Kaffelogic sometimes can be a little bit frustrating, and specifically with power zones. So because of the power zones, didn't really work a lot of the times and weren't as repeatable and as predictable, because it related to the specific amount of power being supplied to the element, based on the PID, steamingly randomness approach. I kind of ditched that sort of thing and just went for a steady flow of air through the coffee during first crack. That seemed to work pretty well. And again, working on other profiles, such as the declining fan profile from, I think it was Steve, that I uploaded to the forum. It does make sense that you would lower the fan speed as the roast progresses, because the coffee is losing mass, and as it's losing mass, the same amount of airflow will kind of blow all the coffee out of the roaster, right? So you have to account for weight change and weight loss, and expansion, the volume increase at the same time. However, in these sort of testing I did, I found that it's not only important that the coffee is, moved in a specific way during first grab, during the first moments of first grab, but throughout the beginnings of development time in general. So that's why I kind of went for a steady fan speed after first crack in general, because I found that while the coffee will still be losing weight throughout development time, so if you end the roast over here or end the roast over here in the same profile, you will notice a change in mass. That change of mass isn't as substantial to actually justify to keep lowering the fan speed in most cases, unless your range of roasting is really broad. I don't know if that makes sense, or if anyone has any questions around that. Okay, so I'll check the chat. So do you use higher fan speeds for higher density wells? Well, I don't really use higher fan speeds for higher density per se, because the main issue with fan speed is weight, not density. As I think I mentioned in the Discord channel as well. If you have 80 grams of really dense coffee and you have 80 grams of a really low in density coffee, it's the same 80 grams, and that's the same amount of force required to actually push those 80 grams, inside the roast chamber, right? However, the coffee that's very low in density, obviously will be higher in volume, right, for that same mass. So I would say that I wouldn't really change based on density, but I would probably go for a smaller batch size if I have really low intensity coffee, if that makes sense. Because it would actually be a more volume to actually take account of. And again, I mean, I think we kind of see density as a really important factor. However, I actually haven't really experienced that much of a difference between one coffee and other coffee just solely based on density. There's usually other stuff that I think are like a little bit more telling, such as size, such as to a certain extent moisture, but in the way it relates to hardness, which I think is again something that we don't really talk about, as well as we don't really talk about pressure in that the same way we talk about temperature, if that makes sense. So if I only had one parameter to try a specific profile for a coffee, if I only have one parameter of the coffee to actually know before roasting it, I would probably go for something like size, because think about it. Most coffee you can actually get will be between 8 to 12% moisture, and hopefully it would be actually between 10 and 12%. So that's a 20% variance from 10 to 20 to 12. And that's not really that much of a difference between one coffee and another in terms of moisture, because a lot of the moisture is going to be getting rid of anyway. And while it plays a role, it doesn't really affect that much in those ranges, I think. So if you have a coffee that's 8% humidity, and you have another coffee that's, let's say, 13-14% humidity, of course you're going to notice a big difference in how you approach it. I'm not saying that you won't, but I'm not particularly sure that the difference we usually see is that important. So a difference between 10% or 11% and 12%, it doesn't really make that much of a difference in how I would approach roast. However, hardness would be very related to moisture, because higher moisture coffee is less hard, it's softer. So that would mean that it would probably be getting up to first crack sooner, because the pressure buildup would need to be lower before actually getting to first crack, and the pressure will be easier to release through a softer structure, right? And that's really what's happening. So that actually kind of explains why we've found, anecdotally, that when we rehydrate coffee, usually the temperature at which first crack happens like a couple of degrees below what the usual temperature actually happens, which I think it's what it's related to. But yeah, the other thing I would really be very aware of before encountering a coffee would be size, because as we know from brewing coffee, surface area, exposed surface area is really important. And if you have a huge, Maragogipe or Maracaturra or an SL or something, big as a seed, if you compare that to, let's say, Ethiopian peaberry or something, or a coffee from Yemen, that's usually a big, difference in size, and that difference in size may very well be over 100%. So the smaller coffees you encounter and the larger coffees you encounter will be much more apart than the drier and the higher in moisture coffees you approach, usually, if that makes sense. Related to humidity and preheat, obviously you need more energy if you rehydrate, but whatever the moisture content will be, maybe do you change preheat to ensure only that bean does not scorch and bean can follow profile? Well, scorching is really like next to impossible in the Kaffelogic, I guess, unless you actually are roasting really, really fast. Let's say under 4 minutes or something. And if the coffee is pretty fragile to begin with. At least that's been my experience. Maybe you have different experiences than mine. But I usually adjust preheat so the coffee follows profile from the very start. That's sort of my gauge into how well the preheat is dialed in. I want the coffee to actually just follow the profile as it just like starts from the curve. So I have a couple of logs over here. So let's say this one. I don't remember which one this one is. Okay, so this coffee, I have a little of an overshoot over here. You can see. Sorry. So with the 500 kilowatts, 5 kilowatts, 0.5 kilowatts, preheat, and this is a 70-gram batch, if I recall correctly. There's a little bit of an overshoot. So I'll just try this one with a different coffee, and I would adjust this in order to actually so the red line just follows the blue line from the very start. That's basically my gauge. Other than that, I don't really have much to say about that. Oh yeah. So how do you know if it's too high? You just see that overshoot over here. If you want, you just want these lines to go as closely to one another as possible throughout the roast in general. If you're going under it, just apply more preheat. If you're going over it, just reduce the preheat, and that's pretty straightforward. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just get back to the profile over here. I have a couple of differences. This one has a little bit more DTR and stuff like that, but it's really the same profile. Yeah. So we went over, smaller, bigger batches. We went over higher or lower temperature with same DTR, same temperature with higher DTR or low DTR, faster roasting, slower roasting. And this one is the thing I expect most people to not read, but I think you should, which is basically, some of the stuff we've been talking about throughout this conference, this video call. Tasting is always the best way to assess roast, and not necessarily of how well the roast is done, but how much you enjoy it. And while you enjoy it, it doesn't mean it can be better. So I think those two ideas are really important for most roasters to have really in mind at all times, is that you are really roasting for your specific preference, and hopefully for the preference of the people around you that you share the coffee with. But that doesn't mean that's like the be all and end all of roasting. You can actually. What I have found is that the ROR curve and the smooth decline on it is a really, really powerful indicator of how well technically a roast is done. But I might prefer a lighter or a darker roast, a more developed or a slightly less developed roast, or anything. But as long as that's sort of taken care of, I think most people will have a pretty good result. Green coffee quality is very important. It's the most important thing that we don't really control that much. We can go for pay a premium for more expensive, more usually better quality coffee. And a great roast will provide transparency, but it's the coffee is the coffee by itself. You're not really. If the coffee had credits like a movie, you would probably be at the end of the credits, not at the very start. You want to be like the actual main cast. You probably won't even be the director, in my opinion. You would probably be like the color editing crew or something like that. If that metaphor actually makes a shred of sense. Always end the roast before the last 2 points of the profile. As I said, these 2 points are meant to be 1 really, but because of the limitations of the software, I can make them 1, so I had to make them 2. And you edit them at the same time. So if you want a higher temperature over here, you would have to press, for higher temperature, let's say 225. And over here, you also have to press 225 in order to the roast to just keep being have the same shape, specifically the ROR curve. And that roast will have a lower development as well because of the slope changed when arriving towards crack. Yeah. Yeah. So must be kept at the same temperature all the time. The last 2 points. Different coffees will behave differently. That's why I can't really have prescriptive recommendations for most coffees in terms of what fan speed they will require, how much, when you actually mark first crack and all that stuff is pretty, up on the air, because we don't really know how to have an actual standard that most people can calibrate themselves to, and why, because we have different amounts of power supply, we have different amount of, we have different fan calibrations and stuff. So it's really hard to just give you a specific number of RPMs or temperature you should end at and stuff like that. So every coffee will behave differently. Yeah, the differences in voltage, as I said, and yeah, just try to make. I know this is really difficult, but just try to make one adjustment at a time. I hope that you're actually using this profile for your usual coffee, and you're actually trying different profiles for a specific coffee. But yeah, just try to make one adjustment at a time. We all kind of want to try different crazy shit on our coffee, and it's great, but I prefer to just have a slow improvement over time than just go like willy-nilly and like randomly encounter the roast I want, just doing huge changes, if that makes sense. Anyway, you do you, but that's sort of my recommendation from within this profile. And lastly, each adjustment has its limits. While this profile is meant to be edited, if, for example, you want to have, let's say a 270, like a 300, end temperature, you could do that in theory, but that coffee would probably be terrible, and you'll have scorching from the very start of the first crack. Probably, you would probably need a lot of preheat to actually do that in general. So just don't do weird shit anyway. Getting like in between the reasonable ranges is usually pretty good most of the time. And again, it's not really that much of it's not rocket science. I have a friend that actually studies rocket science, and he has the phrase, it's not coffee roasting, which is pretty hysterical. But yeah, it's not as difficult as most people actually tell it to be. You just try different things, look for what you want in your tasting. I have recommended other times that if you have a coffee or a roaster that you enjoy a coffee from, maybe try to get the same green coffee, maybe purchase a couple of kilos from them and try to match their roasting, because that would be very insightful in how you actually want to approach roasting in general. And I think most of us really want to just drink good coffee most of the time and not worry about other stuff. If anybody has any questions, that would be great. But other than that, I don't really have that much to say about the profile. Yeah.
No question, but thank you very much for sharing with us your knowledge, which is huge.
Thanks.
So It was a very cool session.
Nice. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see if this recording will be uploaded today. I'll try. It really depends on bandwidth and stuff. I have no idea how heavy this will be, so we'll see. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, you can contact me through the Discord channel as well. Just tag me or anything, and also you can definitely send me a message, via Instagram or something like that. Same name everywhere. Benjamin F. Leon, Benjamin F. Leon. Anyway, so yeah, that's. Thank you all guys for coming. I hope you enjoy profiles. Thank you for all your kind words. But yeah, that's it. I'll just end the recording now.